Hey, back for another week. It's another episode of AngularAir. I'm your host, Justin Schwarzenberger, and today we are going to be discussing and checking out web security within Angular. Joining us as panelists today, we've got Austin McDaniel. Austin, how's it going?
How's it going, everyone?
And we got Mike Brocky with us. Mike, how's it going?
Not too bad, thanks for asking.
All right, and our guest today is Philip. Philip, how's it going?
Hi, very well, thank you. Excited to be here. Yeah.
Get into some web security. Philip's going to show us some stuff and educate us. This should be pretty good. Before we start, let's do a rundown on some NG news here, happenings this past week. Looks like we got a new Angular 4.0.0 RC2 drop that came out, as well as a Angular CLI 1.0.0 RC1 that dropped as well. So those are good. Go get those bits. Anybody else have anything else that came out this week that they want to mention?
When did RC2 drop?
I think the second.
Oh.
Yeah.
It dropped on Wednesday or Thursday of last week.
Oh, awesome.
There you go. You learned something new, right?
I eagerly awaited that one. It was a nice fix because animations were not working with AOT, and that has since been resolved. So kudos on that fix.
Yeah. So and we all know how awesome animations are, right? From our last episode. All right, cool. Let's get into it. Let's talk about web security. Philip, why don't you fill in all of our viewers on what you got going on, who you are, that sort of thing. Give us a rundown.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Philippe De Ryck. I have an unpronounceable name in English, apparently. So just call me Philip, and that's fine. I'm a web security expert. So I do web security in general. I actually did a PhD on web security, and I'm still associated with university, but I'm running commercial security activities, so mainly training, but also some security assessments for companies, things like that. Besides that, I do talks like this, talks just for communities, because security is, in my opinion, very important, and essentially the goal is to build a better and more secure web, and I'm trying to do my best to teach people how to do that. That's essentially it. So I've been doing a lot of things in the coming weeks. I'll be in the US actually. In the week of the 20th, I'll be in the Bay Area for Devoxx US, doing a talk on security headers in Spring there, which is something a bit different than Angular. And the week after, the week of the 27th, I'm in Portland because there's EmberConf, which is, again, not Angular, but I'm doing an Angular talk that week as well to compensate. So I reached out to the local community in Portland, and they're happy to have me talk about Angular. So that's going to be some fun as well. And actually in December, I'm running a workshop on Angular security here in Belgium at the Belgium Angular Conference, NGBE. So that's going to be very fun as well.
I've heard good things about this.
Do you just do a talk somewhere at a conference recently?
We had a course here in Leuven, the SecOpDev course. I co-organized that, but also did a couple of talks there as well. Again, one on Angular security, but two others. One about the general security model of the web. So essentially the very basic same origin policy in the browser and how everything builds on top of that to offer security. And also one about new client-side security features that have been added to the browser in the last 5 years, and how you can use them, which ones are very useful, very important, which ones are a bit more dangerous and should be very careful when you're trying to use them. So that was a lot of fun as well.
Mike, did you have a question? Did I jump the gun over you on that?
No, you're all set. I just have heard really good things about the Belgium conference, NGBE. I've heard that it's a whole lot of fun and very informative.
Yeah, the organization was impeccable. So they had the first one last year, and it was near perfect. So they have a very high bar to reach this year again. So I'm looking forward to that. It was really great.
Nice. So what web security, like we all know SQL injection, stuff like that, escape your strings. Like what are some of the things that like just in general, like us as web developers, we should be doing, not even particular to Angular, in fact?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm glad you're opening with that. So one of the things about Angular is Angular itself is quite new. You have all of these JavaScript frameworks, which are a new way to build applications, but web security-wise, things haven't changed that much in a sense. So we still have SQL injection, and there's still news reports every day about websites or plugins or frameworks failing to do that correctly and resulting in all kinds of harm and breaches and things like that. So yes, we still have the old stuff. So we still have SQL injection, command injection, but we also have the communication channel. So everything is, well, a lot of things are wireless today. So that's definitely an added attack factor that you want to take into account. So today everything should be HTTPS. There's, in my opinion, not even a question about it.
What do you think about the HTTPS, the Open Certificate Initiative, and things like that?
What do you mean? Let's encrypt?
Yeah, Let's Encrypt. Sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome. I use it as well for most of my sites. Actually, it works really well. It takes away the pain of managing certificates. It used to be like this manual process and jumping through hoops to get a certificate from a CA, and they simply automated the process. And essentially they have the same security guarantees as you get when you get a simple domain validated certificate. So I'm a big fan, and they're one of the reasons that today about half of the traffic is actually HTTPS. So I think they did a tremendous job with that, and I hope they keep it up in the future as well.
What are some other tools like that you could like share with some of the viewers that you think are like boilerplate, like us as developers we should know about and be using potentially?
Yeah. Specifically for HTTPS, there's this thing called the SSL Server Test. If you're running a website, that's essentially kind of a mandatory check to do against your server to see what it turns up. So what it does is it scans your website, looks for the parameters of your HTTPS configuration, and then essentially analyzes whether that's a good setup, a secure setup or not. So what they'll do is they check whether you support really old stuff. If you have SSL version 3 enabled, then you're going to get a bad grade. That's kind of a given. But they also check like the specific cipher suites and the very latest options, whether you have enabled them or not. And based on that, they get to a grade, which can be either an F up until an A+. So there's kind of a variation, and you should, of course, aim for the A+. So that tool alone has been really essential for getting where we are today with HTTPS deployment, and we should go even further. So in my opinion,
something you can use in your local development environment, or is that something that you have to point at a running production site?
No, that's for running production sites. It requires a public domain to be registered. It doesn't run on IP addresses to avoid abuse of pointing it to something that it shouldn't be scanning. So it requires a public site. There are some client-side tools you can run offline as well. So there's a guy who actually wrote this in Bash. So there's a shell script you can run that tests your HTTPS deployment. So yeah, test SSL.sh it's called, I think. So you can simply get that from GitHub and run it on your local server without needing to go online. So that works quite well. And there are a few others. I don't have the names. I don't know in by heart, but there are a few other tools that can run offline as well. So these things you can definitely use to scan your internal servers as well.
There you go. So, so we got some of our core standard stuff that we're used to in terms of security for just web development, right? What about specifically for Angular? Like, I mean, is it mainly this stuff, or is there some specific stuff for Angular that we're looking for as well? Or how do we start wrapping that into our mindset as we're building Angular apps?
Well, to be honest, if you're building an Angular app, step one should be it needs to run on HTTPS. There's, in my opinion, there's no reason to run something new not on HTTPS. So I even suggest if you're able to do that, to run your development environment on HTTPS. You can simply use a self-signed certificate for that, because it will help you weed out problems that will pop up later. So one example is if you start including external resources and you include something from an HTTP server, let's say from a CDN, and you include it, everything works while you're developing, and then you push the app to staging or production, and all of a sudden it starts breaking because the resource is not, well, the browser will refuse to load it because it's over HTTP, and you're deploying this over HTTPS. That's one example where you will run into problems there. So another thing is if you're integrating some payment API on the client side, they often require you to run HTTPS as well, even on localhost. So that's another a good reason to start looking in setting that up and essentially working over SSL even there. It doesn't really hurt your development process. You'll still have the same tools available unless you're doing network sniffing, then it becomes a bit more tricky. But I don't think that's kind of a standard development setup. So that shouldn't get in the way too much. That's step number one. And of course, we covered the other stuff. So you need still to do traditional security, authentication, authorization. These things, they remain essential. They're mainly a backend responsibility. So if you're purely a front-end developer, then you'll be able to escape from that. But these things remain important even with Angular applications, and maybe even more so now that everything is moved towards APIs. We definitely need to take that into account. Angular specific, I would say there are two things that radically change when you're talking about a client-side application like an Angular application. One of these things is composing the actual HTML pages. So it used to be server-side. You used to have this server-side application that pushed out an HTML page, sent it to the browser, and the browser rendered it. This means that if you have security problems there, like cross-site scripting, it used to be a server-side problem. It has become a client-side problem now. Well, at least the mitigation has become client-side problems. And the second thing is if you want to use sessions, a lot of services are moving towards these REST APIs without server-side state, meaning that you are keeping session state on the clients, meaning that you'll need to ensure something like integrity or confidentiality of that session data as well. So that's something people often overlook in the process of migrating towards client-side sessions, like just put it on the client, we get it back and everything is fine. But of course, that has become untrusted data now. So you need to be sure that if it says that the user is an admin, that it's actually true and not just something the user has given you just like that. So in my opinion, these two things definitely change for Angular applications.
So our stuff when we're talking about sessions and our data and stuff like that, do we have libraries out there that we know of that are starting to provide this type of solution for us that we can plug into our Angular applications? Or is this something that we're probably all wanting to look at and dive into ourselves as handwriting that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, there's definitely tools you can use. So first of all, for the cross-site scripting part, Angular takes care of most of that for you. So that's one of the good things of moving towards this client-side application. Back when you had a server-side application, the browser received this huge HTML page, and it contained some scripts, and it had no idea which scripts actually belong there and which ones were injected by an attacker. That made it very hard for the browser to do anything against cross-site scripting, and that's why the server needed to do that. In an Angular application, Angular can do that for you because Angular is building your application or your pages, and it knows upfront, like, these scripts were there in the beginning, and I'm putting stuff into the page now. So if there's a script there, probably that's not something you want to do. So actually, I'll go into detail about that in a bit. Actually, Angular has your back there quite well. And the second thing, what technologies used a lot for session management or for session state on the client is JWT or JOT tokens. And these libraries actually, they offer integrity. So they add a signature by default, meaning that if you verify them correctly on the server, so if you use the library to verify the token, then you're actually sure that what you're getting back was issued by someone you trust, which depending on the mode.
JWTs are, JWTs are not a new concept, but I think people actually using them is starting to grow. And how are JWTs different from cookies for the viewers that aren't familiar with that?
Okay, that's a very loaded question because you cannot really compare both because, okay, so let me break this down. So essentially, when you have a JWT, it's a format of storing data. So essentially, it's a standardized JSON format which contains ideally some information about the algorithm, some data, and a signature of the whole object, so you can verify integrity later. Cookies in another cookies are something entirely different. The cookie is simply a storage and transport mechanism of a certain piece of data. So if you set a cookie, the browser will attach it back. So essentially, a cookie transports data, but a cookie can store a JWT token as well. So you can simply put a JWT token inside a cookie, and because they're two different things. So if you want to make that comparison, you should compare on one hand cookies versus a custom header, like an authorization header with a bear value. That's a fair comparison to make. And on the other hand, you should compare a JWT token to either a custom session object stored somewhere or a server-side session. And that's a valid comparison to make. And if you want to go into more detail on that, I can give you the full rundown of the differences and the things to take into account.
Yeah, I mean, we actually just switched over to JWT, and it's a little bit different. There's some different challenges because, like you said, you're sending those requests, that signature in your header. So when you make requests to things like images where you're not making XHR requests, it gets a little fuzzy there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a problem that occurs quite often indeed. So because you're adding the JWT token in a custom header, you can simply have your Angular application do that for every XHR request. Then you get into trouble when the browser starts fetching resources himself without passing to your interceptor or something like that. So one way to address that would be to actually store the JWT token in a cookie and have the browser send it through the cookie mechanism. But of course, if you're using cookies, then things like cross-site request forgery, a very specific attack, they come into play again. So you'll need to make sure that you protect against this kind of attack. So yeah, security isn't always easy, especially on the web. So there's a lot of things that you need to take into account and weigh against each other, like how does my application work and what am I doing here and which technology suits me best. But I think the best thing about JWTs is that they actually, if you do it right, well, if you use the standard libraries, they kind of force you to use this signature by default, which is, in my opinion, a good thing, because when people cook something up themselves, they either don't think about the fact that they need integrity protection, or they mess it up themselves, which actually happened to JWTs as well, but it's fixed now, so it should be fine.
So what about the strategy in terms of getting those resources where you request a short-lived token? So for a resource, for like an image or something, you have an endpoint that says, okay, here's my JWT for my authentication. Give me a ticket for this resource. I get it back. Now I request that resource with that as like a GET request, and I can receive it for that short period of time. Is it a valid strategy?
Yeah, that would also be a way to do it, sure. But of course, that requires you to keep track of those tickets on the server. So essentially, you're kind of moving back towards keeping state on the server and making sure that that you verify against that. So it's definitely a valid strategy. But in some cases, it's worth making posing the question: do we actually need client-side state? Is session state or keeping state on the session so difficult or so problematic for us that we actually need that? That's, in my opinion, that's a valid question for most applications. If you're running a major setup with millions of users, sure, there are going to be some huge performance problems with server-side sessions, but many smaller applications, they can deal perfectly fine with that, and they have a lot of benefits or make it a lot easier for security.
Always a decision to make, right?
Yeah, always. And it's never easy on the web. So
Cool. All right. You want to show us some stuff?
yeah, sure. So let's talk a bit about script injection in Angular. Like I said, Angular takes care of that a lot for you. I'm gonna share my screen here and show you a few sample scenarios I prepared. So is everything okay there? You see it?
Yep.
All right. So let me show you what's going on here. So I prepared a few ways to try and put script into a page. So the first one is essentially, let me show you.
Can you bump the font up a little bit on maybe both those windows too? I think a little bit. Cool. Yeah, that looks good.
Is the text editor readable?
Yeah, a little. There we go. That's probably good.
So let me start with the first one. So this is a very simple. Of course, it's a demo scenario, but this handles any kind of untrusted input, which in this case simply comes directly from the input box here, and outputs it right into the page. So if you type something, it's bound to this value, and the value is put here with double stashes. So essentially, this is how you do most data binding in Angular. So essentially, when you're doing this, Angular is actually taking care of this output. And if you try to put something, let me actually grab something here to put in there. So if you try to put some HTML code here, it simply writes out the HTML code. Essentially, what's happening here is Angular is encoding this for the HTML context. So this is Angular at work. This is very different from a traditional application where this would be a cross-site scripting or a potential cross-site scripting attack vector. It's also a vector here, but Angular here knows that you're trying to put something right into an HTML context, and it says like, whoa, this is potentially dangerous. Let me simply render that harmless for this context, and you should be fine. So if you're doing all your data binding like this, Angular is actually taking care of you and preventing any cross-site scripting attack vectors here. So that's example number one. That's the very simple one. It can become. This is, by the way, something that Angular has always done. Even Angular 1 does this for you. So we're pretty good so far. And I think the other frameworks, I know that Ember does it as well. I'm not a React expert, but I'm pretty sure that they do something very similar. So they protect you as well there. Go to the second example. Again, very, very straightforward. You have the same input, and instead of putting it or interpolating it as this value, you put it directly into an HTML element. So you use inner HTML, you bind it there, and if you try this, if you type test, of course it appears there. That's not the exciting stuff. If you do it like this, actually see that this HTML code is outputted and processed, parsed by the browser. So this bold tag works, and the image tag, well, the image doesn't exist, but it's trying to load the image at least. And this is potentially dangerous, because if you would be able to add scripts here, then you might think that the browser will try to execute this. So let's see what happens. We have the same as before, but we have added an on-error event handler, saying that if the image doesn't exist, trigger this code. But nothing happens, even though that the image is trying to be loaded and doesn't really exist here. Well, I see that I should have copied this not from a rich text editor, apparently. But nonetheless, it doesn't change anything. Because Angular is, again, seeing what you're doing. Angular says like, okay, you want to bind some HTML, that's fine. But I'm going to make sure that you as a developer don't shoot yourself in the foot, and I'm going to take out the dangerous part. So Angular considers this part, or knows that the on error will trigger script execution, and simply filters it out as if you would have put this into the page. And it does this for this whole list of dangerous features, and it actually helps you protect against these kinds of attacks. This is called sanitization. And this is something that's enabled by default in Angular 2, which is very good. It used to be it's also available in Angular 1, but you need to enable this sanitizer manually, meaning that the first time you try this, you get an error, and then people start looking on Stack Overflow for answers, and they find for example, some advice to turn this thing off or bypass it or something like that, and that is how these vulnerabilities exist in applications, and that's what Angular 2 does better. So they do it by default. So unless you actively try to bypass this thing, again, you're very good. You're protected, which is in my opinion a good thing.
So does that mean that as we're thinking about receiving data back, and we got this dynamic data that we're working with HTTP and calls and pulling our data and start putting it into these, we really don't have to think about any type of sanitization coming from our data source because we can just throw it in here and Angular's got our back? Or is that something we still need to be concerned about?
That's essentially what it comes down to, yes. So, and the real thing what's happening here is you used to, well, back with traditional applications, you need to take care of this explicitly on the server. You need to do some sanitization on the server. But if you have an API, you simply push out some JSON data, for example, and the server has no idea what context you will be using this data in. And that's a tricky part. Here it's inside an HTML element, but it could also be inside an attribute or in a style, some CSS stuff. So that's the tricky part about CSS protection. You need to know which context it's being used in. And in a traditional application, you had that on the server because you were putting it into the page yourself. And here Angular has this for you, and Angular takes care of this. That's why Angular is able to take care of this for you. So no, you don't need to worry about that. You need to make sure that your server is outputting valid, your API is outputting valid responses. So that's as far as the server needs to go, and then the client becomes responsible from that point on, because the client will be putting that into an HTML page, into a certain context, and that's where the protection needs to be applied. Unfortunately, this can be done automatically today.
Cool.
All right. So let's go to the third one, which already the hint already gives it away essentially. But let's see what's actually happening here. So if you go here, what we do is we have again this value. I'm going to show the JavaScript code behind this in a bit, but we're binding it to something else and putting that into our inner HTML attribute. And as you may guess, if you put this in, you get an alert box. And an alert box is kind of a good demonstration that cross-site scripting is happening. It's not the worst that can happen with cross-site scripting. So essentially, once you have script running in your application, once I can pop an alert, I can do whatever I want. So I can start stealing your precious JOT tokens if you store them in local storage. I can start running commands from here. I can hook this frame. I can steal images from your webcam. So we're on Google Hangouts now. If I would be able to inject that code into your browser, for example, through the chat feature, I might be able to steal images from your webcam.
I want to see it. Let's see that.
Yeah, if I find that, I'm going to submit it privately to Google. It's going to buy me a lot of nice beers after this talk. So if you find things like that, that's a bug bounty. Essentially, you get a few $1,000s for finding cross-site scripting like that into the major applications. So if you want to get rich, that's a good career. Actually, people have been doing this for a career, finding these vulnerabilities in websites and reporting them and getting money out of that. So that's definitely a good thing. But let me show you what's actually going on here. So why is this working? Well, it wasn't working before. Well, if you would look at the code, let me see. No, it's this one. If you look at the code, you actually see that I'm using this DOM sanitizer, which is the process or the part of Angular that's responsible for sanitizing our data. And what I actually did here is I bound this value to the doing it wrong value because I use this bypass security trust as HTML. And the reason I want to go into this is in Angular 1, this function was called trust as HTML. And this actually gives the idea that you're doing something good because you're trusting a value. So fortunately, they have renamed this to bypass security trust as HTML, which essentially means that you're doing something that is potentially dangerous. And the documentation includes that as well. So you see this, if you go here, you see this huge warning saying that if you do this with untrusted data, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. Your application will be vulnerable. So don't use this in this context, and only use it for very specific cases where you have some static HTML that you actually want to mark as trusted. This is also valid if you want to mark a URL as trusted to load in an iframe or something like that. Then you can also use it on Sanitizer to say to Angular, I specifically acknowledge that this URL does not come from user input, and I know that this is safe. So that's why I want to actually allow that to happen. And in all other cases, please protect me against this kind of thing. So when you see bypass security, that's something that should trigger like, what's going on here? I need to look into what's happening.
So can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
So based on what you previously showed and this here, so my thought goes to, I've got a application that it has a rich text editor that allows people to enter in text that's going to get converted into HTML, and I want to be able to pull that back from my data source and serve that up and display that within my application. The regular inner HTML binding would allow me to do that and help protect me from if that rich text editor got script put into it, right? Like I could just use that without using this bypass security trust and be secure on my rich text content that I'm receiving.
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole point of sanitization. So let me go back here. So let's say indeed you have something like an editor where you can edit in HTML and you get some HTML files. If you put this attack vector in there, what the sanitizer does, it detects the fact that HTML is in there, and it allows the safe stuff to be in there. So you can have images. In this case, it's not loading, but you can have images. You can have the bold tag, obviously, but you can have headers, paragraphs, divs, spans. That's everything is fine. It's the moment you start using things like on blur or on click, that's where the sanitizer will kick in and say like, whoa, this is potentially dangerous because it will trigger scripts. And I'm not going to allow you to do that because you asked me to sanitize this. And obviously script tags will not be in there as well. And well, the sanitizer knows all these different ways that can lead to script execution from HTML code, and it will remove all of those features and leave everything else intact. So that's the cool thing about sanitization.
So if we're really like looking and thinking, okay, like unless there's some use case, which there may be, right? People may have something in their app that they need to do that, but most part, you're going to want to stay away from this bypass, right? Because you can accomplish a lot of the stuff you probably end up running into needing without even using that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the bypass, I think the documentations explicitly mention this. A use case where you might want to use this is if you have some static snippet that you need to inject without, well, that you actually know that it's safe because you wrote it yourself. So the moment you have untrusted data coming from anywhere that might end up here, you're essentially doing it wrong. And you're creating this huge attack vector that will come back and bite you eventually. But this is, well, I think because it's called bypass security, this is less likely to happen now. But it used to happen quite often in Angular 1 applications. Like junior developers not sure what these things do, not having heard about security. They simply run into the problem. They find a solution like, yeah, use trust HTML, and everything is fine. And then everything works. So you don't see the vulnerability until somebody comes by and injects this on error stuff or a script tag. And then, well, then you discover the fact that this is also allowing scripts to pass through.
And then hopefully all you have to do is pay them a bounty, right? And you're not.
Yeah, but also the good thing is because there's a specific way of doing this, you can easily scan your code base for the use of this function, and you can even write some some acceptance tests that scan your code base when you have a new commit and automatically tell the developer like, dude, what the hell are you doing? Are you sure that this is the way to do it, and is this actually okay to do it like that or not?
And to be clear, this is only on this one text box. This is not a globally available setting where you're essentially bypassing security for all rendered HTML. It's just focused to this one value.
Yeah, these functions, you explicitly need to call it on a value, and they output something from the types. Well, let me show you the type save HTML. So if you see here, The type return is actually save HTML, so this is one value only. I really don't want to go to the next part of your question. Yes, there are ways to turn it off, and no, you should not be doing this. Go look on GitHub. You find plenty of discussions of people saying like, yeah, but I know perfectly well that my code is safe and I don't need the sanitizer kicking in, and can I remove it or disable it? And there are some ways to do it, but
No,
don't ever do it.
I wasn't advocating it. I was just being explicit about what this function actually does.
Yeah,
Just comment it out in the download of Angular.
Yeah, so yeah, you're absolutely right. This is meant to be used in very very special circumstances only, not as a general concept, and it's definitely not recommended to turn this thing off altogether. If you're doing that, essentially all protection is out the window, and well, yeah, it's just waiting until somebody comes by and takes over your application, essentially. All right. So there's maybe one more case that we need to discuss. So these are all the things that you have in Angular itself. There's the conclusion here is that Angular does it very well. There's one scenario where Angular is not very able to protect you, and that's essentially in a scenario called well, dynamic templates or server-side templates or something like that. So let me show you. So the setup of this scenario, I haven't implemented this fully because I didn't feel like running this web server here locally. But essentially what you're doing here, or what some people are doing, is combining Angular with an old application, like an old school PHP application, for example. So the thing is sitting there, it's legacy code, but your boss doesn't want to wait 3 months until you've rewritten the whole thing into an API and an Angular front end, but you still want to use Angular, so you can start combining both of them together. So you're like, yeah, we have some PHP output, that's fine. We'll load the Angular library in there, and then we can use some of the Angular features to build a nice UI on top of that. And this is okay as long as you use a specific API to fetch your data. The moment you start combining your code with like this, so you have some PHP output, you try to do some XSS protection on the server because you're outputting data on the server, so you need to protect against cross-site scripting. The moment you do that, you're in trouble because people can enter this as a username. So if I enter as a username this funky thing, PHP does not consider this to be harmful because this isn't HTML code. This is okay. This is not a really valid username probably, but it's simple text data. It doesn't mean anything in an HTML context. It only means something in an Angular context. And if you, well, let me show you that this actually works. If you would do this here and you load that page, then it should trigger something. Huh, I broke this apparently. I'm not sure what's going on here. But essentially, okay, yeah, I know what's going on here. Okay, that's funny. I didn't try this out before. So essentially, when you start doing this, normally this would trigger a problem because Angular would process the HTML, would see that this is something that's Angular specific, and would start processing this. And this, well, is essentially a way to break out of your scope and access the window object where you can eval this alert code. The reason this is not working, I believe, is because I enabled AOT mode for some other stuff I wanted to show. And AOT mode would compile the template up front and only process it afterwards. So essentially, this means that this will not be picked up again by the browser when he's trying to process this template because it's already compiled. So if I'm correct, it should be working now. Otherwise, yeah, I'm kind of failing on this episode.
No way. I think you're conveying the point here. So we just have to see it in action. But no, you're doing a good job.
Okay. That's a fail on my part because I have no idea why it's not working here today. So yeah, my apologies for that.
So can you talk really quick about this, like what's going on here with when you're talking about the PHP side serving that code prior to Angular running that? I'm just kind of trying to follow there on how somebody would have that set up in terms of if they're wrapping these two, like their legacy app and stuff like that.
Yeah, so essentially the kind of setup you have there is you have your traditional pages on the server, and you what you typically would do there is you would render the initial page using some parameter information or some session information from the PHP page, and then you kick off or you start your Angular library. Well, Angular bootstraps the application, and from then on you can interact with a part of the application in a very interactive and dynamic way, which is essentially because you're running a client-side application, which is what makes it so attractive. So if you have this specific part, or you need to render tables of stuff like that, people often want to use Angular for that. The problem is because you're still running your PHP application, you need to do your server-side cross-site scripting protection, and that's where it becomes tricky, because essentially Angular has changed the way that static the way that HTML or text data is perceived, and that's why once you start injecting specific Angular code in there that PHP will consider to be safe, Angular will pick that up and start executing that if everything works as it should work, essentially. That is what this scenario comes down to, and that's also something they say in the documentation that you shouldn't be doing. This is something that's very hard to protect against. They tried in Angular 1 with the expression sandbox, but people kept finding bypasses against that and took that out. So they took it out because it was unmaintainable and bypassable. Angular 1 is vulnerable to this. Angular 2 is vulnerable to this as well, but not if you do this ahead of time compilation, because when you do that, actually you compile your template up front and insert the data afterwards, and that essentially gets rid of the problem, because you know up front where you're going to insert data, and you're not going to get confused by some injected Angular code.
So would you say it's really probably worthwhile that people should approach that in terms of solving that in a different way, like maybe taking on the time it's going to take to really, because it's worth it from a security standpoint, to really find different ways to get that content from their static site or their other server-side rendering over to their Angular application, maybe through an HTTP, through an endpoint, or some preloaded data, that sort of thing?
Yeah, if you're running such an application, yeah, that's definitely something you need to address, because it's going to be very hard to get right. So you're better off essentially loading Angular separately and then fetching the data using XHR calls and loading it on the client side. That's going to ensure that you have the protection Angular offers you, and that's going to help you prevent these weird bypasses on the server side, because it's going to lead to nothing but trouble if you start combining both. So essentially, my advice I give in talks is don't do this. People building Angular advise against this, so it's there for a reason, and you should follow that advice.
So we could really go to our project leads and our CEOs and say, look, we can do this, but it's a big security risk. I mean, you sure you want to take that, and then kind of play that card and work this process?
Yeah, sure. You can definitely play that card, but security is already already has a bad reputation cost-wise and time-wise. So I'm not sure how they're going to respond to that. Like, security again? Yeah. Use it as an argument. Don't build it like that.
That's true. Well, why is that? Can we get to a point where security is more of a first-class concern across the board, and we're okay with that? Like, I mean, what do you see when you go out there and you're doing your talks and stuff, and how are people receiving that? Are they is that still the approach of not security again, or are people embracing that?
It depends on the type of company. So I've given trainings in companies where they they have a dedicated security team, which is really well staffed, and they do it very well. And essentially, when I'm explaining security mechanisms and new security policies, developers actually were like, oh, we've been using that for a year or 2 years because we had to from the security team, but now we actually understand what it does. So those companies are doing a very good job. On the other hand, I also have companies that are just barely scratching the surface on security, and they have only one guy responsible for security. So they're, well, but for them. But I would say, well, where I see it going is this is something that's starting to pick up. Security or building secure applications is going to become a competitive advantage. So some customers will start demanding that. So that's going to be the main driver, I think, for actually caring more about security and making security more important, even though it's probably gonna cost a bit more to do it the right way instead of just get something working. So I definitely hope that we're moving towards that direction.
I think with with all the news, you're going to see a lot more higher up people starting to really emphasize this in these software organizations, right? Like if I can lose my whole company if some developer forgets to escape some HTML because of a lawsuit, right? You're going to see a lot more buy-in when those type of news articles and what we see happening is a positive effect, I feel like, and it's continuing to grow in adoption for better or for worse from all that publicity.
Yeah, absolutely. But one of the requirements there is that people, or the higher up people, actually need to understand what security is and how security works. So one of the things there, or the misconceptions there, is that security is like this check you go through when you build your product and it's almost finished, and the last step is, let's do a security check. And then sometimes they find minor issues which you can fix, but sometimes they find like crucial design flaws in your application, and then you're faced with a choice, like go back 6 months in time and actually address them correctly, or slap some patch on there and hope that nobody finds what we did, and
we
get
not
away
like
with it.
Going through TSA at the airport.
So when you want to do it right, then I think the main lesson, or the main message here, is that security is a process. It's not something you do one time and you're done with it. It's something you build up, and that should be carried by your whole organization, and not by a few people or one external consultant doing this pen test of your application before you release it into the wild.
How we treat it is, people write unit tests, and that's part of a delivery of a particular feature set. Well, so is the security factor. So we factor that checklist into every feature that we're delivering. Is it unit tested? Is it security checked, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very good way to do it, and a very good way to raise awareness. And yeah, you need to get everybody on board. And something that might help as well is, it's like having this security checklist of things you need to be doing and need to be checking, or for new applications or new components or whatever. Like, does it run on HTTPS? Sure. Does it load external resources? Then the question is, why does it do that? And how do you know whether these resources are actually secure? Who do you trust? If you're loading external script, you're essentially trusting a third party to run something in your application, and hope that they behave on one end, but also hope that they take security as serious as you do, because if they get compromised, then you will be the one suffering from it. That's what we see with all these advertisers. One bad advertisement ends up in the network, and it's served to millions of users and defacing websites all over the place, because you trust them to do the right thing. And well, sometimes they do, but sometimes they also have problems there. So.
Now, you talked earlier about possibly having in your build system a check, and say, okay, look, is this bypass security trust URL call within the code that's being committed? Can I check that? What about also stuff like, is there something like a concept of linting that we could have where we get these linters that check our code for security stuff and can let us know in our editors and IDEs of, hey, we're potentially doing some security stuff?
That's something that people are working on. So I know one tool that's actually quite good at that. It's called Checks from Codiscope, which is a very new static analysis tool essentially that is able to understand Angular applications and JavaScript applications. And their vision is to move towards the API, so that towards the IDE, so that they essentially can give you near real-time feedback about when you're doing something potentially insecure. When you're using one of these insecure functions, they will be able to flag that immediately and say, like, dude, what the hell? But also other things, like if you're using untrusted data in some places, if you're using weak cryptography functions, things like that. So yes, that's something we see for the traditional development frameworks or languages, and that's definitely something that will be coming to web development in the coming years as well.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of vendor tools out there when it comes to like the enterprise that we see getting adopted. Things like HP Fortify, where it does static code analysis on check-ins and things like that. But they're not really, I think the big gap that we see is they're not really doing a lot of the JavaScript specific type of operations. They're more for the traditional web applications, and they might have some JavaScript stuff, but most of the time it's just wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So they've been around for quite some time, and they have done a very good job on Java applications and traditional web applications. But they're struggling with JavaScript and Angular and the whole way that these applications are built, and that's something that needs to be addressed in the future. And that's definitely something I presume that these major companies are working on as well. So they cannot afford to simply ignore this and then in a couple of years discover that apparently Angular is kind of a big thing on the web, and that they should have thought about that a bit sooner. So I presume they're working on that. I don't know specifically, but I'm pretty sure that they are, and they will definitely bring out support for that in the future, I hope.
Cool. Hey, we got a little bit more time here. We got one more. We got a question on our YouTube channel for if you could go over a little bit about Angular and CSRF. I mean, we have a few minutes left. Maybe you can.
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to. So I'm not going to be able to give you the full rundown of what it is, but if you look on my website, there are videos from previous talks where I cover this in a bit more detail with some images and slide material. So that's going to be a bit more interesting to look at probably. But in a nutshell, what it comes down to with CSRF or CSRF is that you send a request to a backend, and the browser attaches the cookie automatically, and essentially the backend has no idea whether this request came from your application or from just about any other website running in your browser, because it can still make the same requests and the cookie will be there. And that confusion is cross-site request forgery, because you're forging requests from a different context, and it's typically cross-site. The way to protect against this, not use cookies. That's one way. That's something that happens if you have, for example, a JOT token in the authorization header. Then CSRF is not a problem, because only requests coming from your context will have the token, and requests coming from outside, from somewhere else, will not have the token, because they didn't pass through your interceptor that added the token himself. So that's one way to avoid that. And if you actually want to mitigate that, if you're using cookies, then the right way to do that is in Angular is to set a second cookie called an XSRF token, which contains a random value. And Angular, well, this is actually a pattern that can be used for any kind of application, but Angular already supports this out of the box. So when it sees this cookie XSRF token, it will copy that value into a header, which is called XSRF token. And the header will be added to every outgoing request coming from an Angular application, and the server will be able to verify that whether that's the same as the cookie. So essentially how this works, again, look at the images if you want a bit more detail, but essentially what happens there is only your context can read the cookie and copy it to the header. So that's why nobody else can do this. And the server doesn't need to keep track of the tokens he issued. He simply gets the cookie he set before, the XSRF token cookie, and he gets this header that only your application could have set, and he needs to compare both values. And if both values are the same, then he knows that this token was his token, and only you could have copied it, so the request is legitimate. If the header is not there, or it's different, or something else, then he knows that it probably either something went wrong or it came from somewhere else, and somebody is trying to guess the token or the value in the cookie. So it's important that the token is in the cookie is of course random, and it changes for every user, and maybe even during the runtime of the application as well. I hope that answers your question there.
That was a pretty good rundown in a short amount of time. That was really good.
Yeah, that's what I do. So
nailed it. All right. So you mentioned your talks that you're going to be doing coming up, and some stuff that you have on there. Do you blog? Do you have some other writings, other places that people can find out more information about the stuff that you do and you share?
Yeah, my website contains essentially all the information. So I put slides from presentations on there. If there are videos, I link to them as well. I have a short newsletter about web security, which runs every 2 weeks, and I keep it down to the 5 most important things you need to know about. Essentially, because there's so much information out there, it's hard for me to keep up. So I can imagine how it must be like for people not doing this as a full-time job, how difficult it is. So that's the reason I'm doing that. And whenever I find some time, which is not too often, I try to write some blogs with some technical content as well. But the main things to follow is well, my website for slide material and my Twitter feed for security news, because I tweet about that regularly. I point to useful documents, resources, things like that. So.
And what's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, it's my name in full. It's @Philippe De Ryck. Yeah, just Google me. The website is websec.be. That's the easiest to remember, and you'll find my Twitter handle from there.
Cool.
Yeah.
We got your name in the title of this video, so they can grab it from there, and we'll also put it up in the episode notes as well.
Yeah, awesome. So that's gonna be then it's gonna be easy to find. Otherwise, yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, let's wrap this show up with some picks. Put a bow on it and call it a week. Austin, you got any picks?
Yeah, actually, only one. My team actually put out we publish ngX charts, which is a data visualization library built on Angular for drawing SVGs. We actually just put out a new chart type called ngX charts DAG, which does directed acyclical graphs, which is really cool for like workflow and like mapping systems and things like that. So we just pushed that out today. So definitely a cool thing to check out.
Cool. Mike?
Excuse me. I just have one. It's non-technical. Just the Google Play Music desktop player. So if you use Google Play Music, as I do, it's nice to have just a desktop client rather than having a dedicated browser tab open to that. So just a local application that you can run. And if you happen to be using a MacBook with a touch bar, it integrates into that as well. So nice, simple controls to listen to music as you code.
Nice. Nice. My pick is Reveal.js. It's a web-based framework for doing slides and presentations. Kind of working on a presentation right now for ngCom, and I'm using that, and it's pretty slick, so I like it a lot. Some of you may have heard of it, but Reveal.js is my pick. So, Philip, you got anything you want to plug here before we end, or?
Nothing specific, no. So instead of giving you a pick, I would encourage you to look up some security info and follow at least one security-minded person. Doesn't need to be me. It can be anyone in the community. There are plenty of other people that have interesting stuff to share. So do that instead, and keep some track on security news and learn how to integrate security into your applications. That's my main message here.
I totally want to endorse that pick for sure.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Philip, for coming on and sharing this stuff with us. We really appreciate it, enlightening us on security and hopefully getting people to focus more on it and bake that into their regular development cycle. So thanks a lot for sharing. Appreciate it.
Very welcome. Glad I was here, and thanks for having me.
All right. And thanks, Austin and Mike, for coming on as panelists. And we will see you next week. Later.